Hey, what's up everyone? I'm Dennis Ivy, developer advocate here at Appwrite, and in this video, I'm going to cover building out server-rendered applications with Next.js and Appwrite. So specifically, I want to focus on adding in authentication into our apps. I want to talk about how you can create protected pages from unauthenticated users and how you can protect your API routes as well. So we're going to do all of this with no third-party packages, so no Next auth or anything like that. We're just going to use Next.js and Appwrite, and we're going to build this out from the ground up so you can see the entire process and really understand how all of this works and how you can integrate this into your own apps. So the application that we're going to build out in this demo is all server rendered. So that means that we have no client-side pages or components at all. That includes our login form, which is also going to be server rendered. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to build first. So this right here is the project that we're going to have by the end of the video, and let me show you how everything works. So first of all, everything is server rendered. So when I click login here, this is going to trigger a server action. It's going to generate a session for me. Then it's going to set that session cookie. So we have this API route right here, and this is how we're pulling in data. And right now we can see that we're being blocked because there is no session within my browser's cookies. So I'm going to click login. This is going to generate that session for me and redirect me to my dashboard. So this is the second page of the application. It's only 2 pages. And here we can see these orders. So this is actually calling a real database. So at some point, you're going to want to set up an Appwrite database, go ahead and create a collection, and then just fill in some data there. It doesn't matter what you have in there, but in my case, I'm just doing orders. So now if I go to my API route, if I refresh this, we're going to see the session cookie. And now I can see all of this data. Now, if I manipulate this cookie or happen to just delete the session, let's refresh it. Now I'm blocked and I can't access this. And if I refresh this page, now I can't access that page because the session has been deleted or manipulated, and that's the entire application. So really quickly, I wanted to highlight why I'm making this video in the first place, because I think this is important to this specific topic. So there's already written content and videos out there on this topic, integrating Next.js with Appwrite. But the issue here is that there's a bunch of different ways you can build out Next.js applications. Now, a lot of these videos and articles usually are using client-side rendering, which is really just React apps that use Next.js. And if they do server-side rendering, they're doing that for part of the app. But when it comes to authentication, it just moves to client-side rendering. And there's really very little content, if any, that just do SSR. So that's really the main focus here, is to show you how that part works. Now, if I do something here that maybe isn't the best, or if you have a recommendation or a question, feel free to leave me a comment down in the comment section. I'm watching these, and I'm going to keep adding more tutorials on this channel, specifically on SSR and Next.js with Appwrite. We'll also do some fun projects, really show you some use cases, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Okay, so we're going to kick things off by setting up a completely new Next application. So the next 5 to 8 minutes or so are just going to be setting up some template code, adding some styling. So we're going to speed run through this part pretty quick. I just want to make sure that you don't miss a single step in this process, so you don't think my configuration is different than yours. This way, nothing's missed. So let's go ahead and run npm create next app, and we're going to call this next-appwrite. You can call it whatever you want. Give the project a name. I'm not using TypeScript, so we'll hit no for that. We are going to use ESLint. Make sure we're using that. Tailwind. We are starting at the source directory, and we are using AppRouter, and I do want to import with aliases. So that part's up to you. We'll just make sure to set that up. And I'm going to use VS Code for my text editor. So let's go ahead and go to my desktop. This is my project right here. We'll open that up, and the project just got finished setting up here. So let's go ahead and clear out some code. So first thing is, let's start in the source folder here. Let's go into our app folder, and we're going into global CSS. So I'm going to import my own CSS. I have very little set up here, so we're going to just go ahead and remove everything here. We'll leave the Tailwind imports, and let's go into our page.js file. So the home page, let's go ahead and remove everything inside of the main tag here. So we'll just go ahead and highlight that, clear it. Let's go to this main tag, clean up the CSS. And the first thing I'm going to do here is go ahead and create a div for my table. So our homepage is going to just be some orders being rendered out. You can create your table any way you want and enter any data that you want in there. I'm just going to use orders as my example. So let's create a div. That's going to be the container for the table. And for the table itself, let's go ahead and usethead for the table header, and we're going to create a table row. Now for this table row, I'm just going to paste in some columns here. So we have th, these tags right here, we have a customer, status, type, and a total. And that's where we're going to leave it for now. So also inside of the video description, there is a link to the final source code for this project. You should definitely use this just to see what we have. If you're confused anywhere, you can reference this. What I'm going to do here right now is go into the source folder, and I just want to make sure that we can copy the CSS file. So we want to get the global CSS. This is going to be in the app folder, and I have a little bit of CSS prepped here. So just some basic styling on my body and the basic like buttons and input fields. These are just styled so we have something that looks decent inside of our page, and then some IDs that are actually styled for the login form and for our order container. So let's just bring this in. We'll paste all of this in. So let's just paste that over our Tailwind imports because we already have those, and I did copy everything. So we'll save that, and let's just run our server. Let's just make sure that our app looks good. So we'll run npm run dev. Let's check this out. So on port 3000, I already have that saved in my bookmark right here, so port 3000, and let's just make sure it's working. Okay, so this is our table right here. We added in some styling. I want to make sure that we style this container. So this div right here is going to take on this ID. We just add a border, some border radius, padding, shadows, and so on, just like you saw in the example. So let's add that here. So we'll do orders-container, and it should look like this. So that looks a little bit better. Now, for the rest of the page here, I'm going to use a little bit of Tailwind. So let's go into the main tag here, and we'll give this a class, and we're going to call this container, and then we'll do mx-auto to center that, and then we'll do max-width, and we're just going to set this to 800 pixels just to make sure it's a little bit more centered. So that looks better right there. Okay, so that's our homepage. Let's quickly add in a login page. So within the app folder, let's go ahead and create a folder called login and then a page.js file. This is where our login page is going to be. I'm going to use a shortcut to generate a component. And in here, let's go ahead and actually create the login form. So we're going to have a div. And within this div, we're going to create a form. And within the form, each field here is going to be wrapped inside of a div here. That way we can add in our own styling if we want to customize those field groups. So let's go ahead and create the label. The first one is going to be an email label. Then we want to add in an input field. Type is going to be email. And the name will also be email. And the placeholder value, let's just say enter your email. Okay, ... like that. And we can close that off. So I'm just going to copy this, paste this over. This will be password, and this is going to be the type of password. So it's a password field, and the name will also be password like that. So enter your password for the placeholder text, save that, and then last thing is we'll create a div around our actual login button. So we'll do an input field, type will be submit, and then the value will just be login. Okay, so just some redundant stuff. We just want to make sure that it looks good. Inside of the form, let's just add in an h3 tag, and we'll just say login. Then we'll create a paragraph tag, and here we'll just say enter your information to log in. Okay, so that should create our login form. And let's just go ahead and check that out, make sure that it's working. So we'll do login. Here's the form. So I also want to make sure that we have some container around that. So inside of my global.css file, I also did add in this ID right here for login form. It also just centers that and make sure that it actually looks good. So we'll add that to the form tag itself. ID is login-form. Okay, so that's our project. We have our login page and we have our dashboard. The next step here is to go ahead and connect to our backend. So the expectation here is that you already have an Appwrite project set up. So if you don't, go to appwrite.io, create a new project. It'll guide you through the basic steps. And I want to show you what your basic backend needs to have set up before we continue here. So first of all, you want to make sure that you have a database set up. Go to the databases tab, create a database. Mine is called prod. Create a collection and go ahead and add in some data here. So set up some attributes, whatever you want is fine. I call this orders, and then I added the status, customer ID, total, and type attributes along with some data. So go ahead and fill that out. Make sure you have something that you can make a request to. Now, the next thing here is to make sure that we have a user. So we are going to be performing authenticated requests. So we want at least one user so we can actually log in. So I'm going to create this user. We're going to call this user Dennis Ivy. And for the email, we'll do dennis@email.com. For the password, I'll just do password 123. Make sure that that's the correct password. Okay. And let's create that. So from here, we need to go ahead and actually configure Appwrite to our Next.js application. And if you've used a client SDK, this configuration is going to be a little bit different from what you're used to, because typically if you're using a web SDK with React or any other front-end framework or just JavaScript, you would just go ahead and select web and go through this process right here and use the client SDK where you just install Appwrite with Node or NPM. So this is different because we're going to use SSR, we're going to use a server SDK, and we're specifically going to use the Node Appwrite SDK. Now, when we connect with one of these, the way that we give permission to a server SDK is by simply using an API key, or that's how we can at least create one of the client instances to actually make certain requests. So we're going to create an API key and give permission to this specific key. So let's go ahead and click on API key, and I'm just going to call this main. And this is going to be like that main admin API key. So I really want to make sure this does not get exposed. Nobody can see this, because anybody with this key will be able to perform all authentication requests, all database requests. And from here, let's just go into function, storage, messages, and anything else. So I just want to make sure this specific key has full permissions. So any client instance of this key has a lot of access to our backend. So make sure that's hidden. And from here, I need to go ahead and set up some environment variables. So we're going to go through this part real quick. I'm going to use this API key, and I'm going to create a env file, but I'm going to use the .env.example file from our repo. And let's just go ahead and copy this and copy in our information. So your project is going to potentially look different than mine if you have different data. Obviously, the IDs and keys are going to be different. So inside of the root directory, let's go ahead and create a .env file. So it sits in the outermost file, or outermost folder. Let's go ahead and paste that in. So we're still connecting with this endpoint because I'm using Appwrite Cloud. And for the rest here, I'm just going to copy that secret key. We'll bring this in right here. And then I need my project ID, database ID, and collection ID. So let's go into overview. And this is my project ID. Paste this in. And then let's go into databases, copy this, and bring this in. And then orders, if you don't have this called orders, whatever you have that called, make sure you just change that. And let's copy the collection ID. Okay, so that's my environment variables. From here, let's go ahead and create our Appwrite client. So again, if you've used a client SDK, this is going to look a little bit different. So we're going to create two client instances. We're going to create, first of all, a admin client. So this is the client that uses the ID or the API key that we just created. And then we're going to create a session client. So once we log in, we're actually going to create a session and pass in that session into that client. And then that's how we perform authenticated requests on the behalf of a user using a server SDK. So let's go ahead and create this inside of the source folder. We're going to create a new folder and file. We're going to call the folder Appwrite and then config.js here. And let's go ahead and install Node Appwrite. So we'll clear this and we'll do npm I node-appwrite. So this is definitely a key difference if you've used the web SDK before. Typically, you would just install Appwrite. Now we're using Node Appwrite. And from here, I'm just going to go ahead and install Axios while we're here because we are going to need that. And I'll just clear this and run npm run dev again, make sure that server's on, and let's minimize that. So let's go ahead and import our client. So a lot of this is going to look somewhat similar to the web SDK, and we want to import databases, or at least these classes right here are going to look the same. And we want to import account, and that's from node-appwrite. And then let's go ahead and create our client instance. So on each request, we're going to create a new client. So let's go ahead and create a function that can initialize this client anytime we need it. So we're going to go ahead and create this. We'll do create admin client, and we'll just make sure that this is an async function. And in this function, we're going to create a client instance here. So we'll do new client, and we'll just initiate a client with some different parameters. So we're going to pass in set endpoint. We'll also do set project. So this is typical if you've used a client SDK, but the next parameter is going to be set key. So that's going to allow us to authenticate this user with that API key for this client instance. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and pass in some environment variables here. So we'll just go ahead and pass in our public endpoint, our project ID, and our API key. So we'll just call process.env, and then that's how we can access these environment variables right here. Now, once we create this client instance, we want to actually return something to the user that calls this. So whenever we call this inside of an API route, we want to, let's say, get access to the user and make sure they're authenticated. So let's go ahead and return. And in here, we're just going to go ahead and pass in get. And first, we want to get our account here. So for this account, we want to return an instance of account. So we'll do new account like that, and we'll pass in this client. Now, we also want to be able to access our database here if we need. So we'll just pass in databases, and this will go ahead and return an instance of databases. We'll do return new databases, and we'll pass in the client again. So this function initiates that client and returns these instances. And in the future, I can pass in more values here if I need. For now, I'm just going to need access to account and databases. So now I just want to go ahead and export this. So we'll export create admin client, and I want to go ahead and create an API route and actually request some data using this admin client. So in the future, I don't want an admin client to actually perform this request. I want a session client to perform the request, so I actually know what user is making that request, but we'll update that as we go. So from here, we'll go into app. Let's go ahead and create a new folder called API, and we'll call this orders. And then we'll create a file called route.js here. So we'll create a basic API route. Let's go ahead and export async, and then we'll create the function. We'll make this a get request. We'll pass in request here, and let's go ahead and return. For now, let's just do response.json, and we'll just say orders. So let's make sure that this route is working. So I just want to go ahead and open that up. And let's go into /API/orders and make sure that we have this. Okay, so here we have our orders. So we have a basic API route. Now, to make request as an admin client, what we need to do is go ahead and import our create admin client function here. So we're going to import that, and then we're just going to go ahead and get the databases instance. So we're going to extract that. We'll call databases, and we're going to call a wait, and we'll call create admin client. So this gives us databases here. And from here, we can just go ahead and get our information. So we're going to go ahead and get documents, and we're going to create an alias here. So we're going to call that orders, and then we want our total. And this is coming from a wait databases.list documents here. And within list documents, we want to go ahead and pass in our database ID. So process.env.next_public, and then we're going into database_ID, and then we want to get our collection ID next. So we're just going to copy this right here, and we're just making a standard Appwrite request here. So we'll just do collection_orders like that. So create the instance, make the request here. We're going to see that as orders, and then in this response here, we can just go ahead and return orders and total like that. So that's the response from Appwrite, and let's just make sure that our API route actually gets that. So it's refreshing right now, and here we go. I'll zoom out, and we just made that request. So notice that typically when you create a collection here, typically you would need to go ahead and configure your permissions here. Right now, we don't have any permissions set, but because we're using that API key, we can actually override these permissions. Now, we will need to update this a little bit later once we use a session client, but for now, we have our data and we're able to override it. So that's usually why it's not too safe to just use an API key to make requests like this. Typically, you want some kind of authentication or make sure that you trust the source that's actually making the request. So once we actually make the request, let's go ahead and just quickly render these orders out, and then we're going to move on to creating that session client. So we'll go into our page here. We'll go into page.jsx. Let's go ahead and import Axios here. We're going to make this request directly from this page here. And because this is a server rendered component, let's go ahead and make this an async function because we can make these requests directly from here. So let's just use Axios. So we'll do const response, and we're going to make a request back to our own API route. So we'll just do equals await axios.get, and we're going to make a get request to API/orders. So we're going to copy that URL. Let's bring this in right here, paste that in, and then let's just go ahead and get the actual orders, and orders is coming from response.data. Okay, so real quick, let's just go ahead and create a table body. So we'll do T body, and I'm going to make sure to scroll down here. we'll create a table row, so tr, and we just want to map through this. So for now, we'll just do td. We'll create one of these, and let's just render the data out. So let's go ahead and do orders.map, and we'll get each order on each iteration. Let's actually create the function, and let's take in tr, pass this in right here, throw that in, and then let's go ahead and set the key actually for each order. So we'll do order.id, and that's with the dollar symbol before, and then the actual data here, we're just going to do order.customer, and let's just go ahead and copy and paste this over a few times and change the values. So we'll just do this 3 times, and the next one's going to be status, then we'll do type and total here. So for customer, I also just want the customer name and email. So what I'm going to do here is just go ahead and remove this. So I'll copy that, and we'll just indent that, use a strong tag, paste in the customer, and then for the next one, we're going to do customer underscore email and change this to a paragraph tag right there. So we just rename those, and let's take a look at what we have. So right now we're on our API route. So let's go ahead and go into our actual front end here. We want to go into our dashboard, and this looks good. So right now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a session client. And before we log in, this request right here is going to fail because we're going to create a condition here that basically says this request is going to be made. If we aren't authenticated, which we won't be in the beginning, the request is going to fail itself. So I want to start by showing you how to create a protected page. Now, there's tons of different ways to create protected pages. You can create a protected layout and then nest everything in that. And then at the very top, check for a user. A very common way to do this is to use middleware. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create some middleware, and then we're going to put the logic in there. So middleware is going to fire off before anything ever happens into our app. So before this page is rendered, we're going to trigger middleware. If you're not familiar with how that works, it basically gets called before anything else happens. And in there, before our page actually renders, we're going to say, hey, is the user actually here? We're going to check it. If the user's not, then we just say, hey, we're not going to send the user to this page right here. Go to the login page. So we can actually redirect a user, and that's how we can control if a user can access it. You can do the same for certain user permission levels, like an admin user or a basic user. So let's start with some basic middleware just to see how it works. So first of all, within our source folder, let's go ahead and create a new file, and we're going to call this middleware.js, and we're going to create this function to just go ahead and actually handle that middleware process. So we're going to do export async function here, and we're going to call this function middleware. I always forget that E. We're going to pass in the request here, and then let's just go ahead and return next response, and let's just go ahead and call .next here. So let's just console this out. Let's just do console.log, and let's just say middleware ran. So let's just make sure that this actually works in the first place. So right now, if I open this up, this middleware, if spelled right, so middleware request all within the source folder. Okay. So if I call this page, we should see middleware run on the server. So here we go. We see middleware ran multiple times. So I don't want this to always be triggered. I want to specify what routes and conditions this actually gets called on. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and create some configuration. So we'll do export const config, and we're going to say only run this middleware. At this point, we're going to create a matcher and say only run it when a user tries to access the home page and not our API route or any other page. So we're going to create this matcher here, and we're going to pass in the path that we want to run this on. So now, instead of seeing this multiple times, if I go ahead and refresh this page, we're going to see middleware ran only once here. So we don't see it multiple times. So now if I access this API route, it doesn't get triggered. We won't see it here. It's only on that home page. So from here, now let's just go ahead and create a fake scenario. So we're going to say, okay, in this middleware, we want to go ahead and check this user. And at this point, before we actually get the user, we're going to set this value to false. So we're going to just pretend we don't have a user yet, and we don't. So let's go ahead and run a condition. We'll say if we don't have a user, let's go ahead and redirect this user, and we can remove middleware right here. Let's go ahead and return, and we're going to return response like that. So we need to actually create this. So we'll do const response. We're going to set up next response.redirect. And we just want to go ahead and create a new URL for this user to be redirected to. So we're going to say if the user is not authenticated, go ahead and send the user to the login page. And it's really as simple as that. So here we're going to pass in request.url, and that should redirect our user and we won't be able to access that page anymore. So here we go. If we're not authenticated, now I'm set to the login page. If I try to go there again, can't access it. So now we want to protect this API route. Now we could use middleware for this. There's different ways to do this. I want to show you how a session client works now. So let's protect this. So right now we don't have any session in here. So if I go to application, go to my cookies, nothing in here. Let's fix this. So inside of this client instance within Appwrite config, let's go ahead and create the session client. So an admin client has permissions based on their key. A session client will have permissions based on the user that's attached to that session. So we're going to completely duplicate this. So we have create admin client. The second one, we're going to change this to session. Then in here, we're going to pass in a session, and we're going to remove set key from our session client. And the difference here is we're still creating a client instance. But when we create our session client, we're going to pass in this session, and we're going to say if we have this session, go ahead and call client.set session, not self-assign, but set session, and pass in the actual session value. So this right here is how we authenticate a user based on a session, something that was added in Appwrite 1.5. I have a different video on this topic. It's a little bit shorter if you want to happen to check that out. But this is how we actually create the session client. Now, within our route, let's go ahead and actually modify this to actually check if we have this session client. So we're going to change this to create session client, and I just want to make sure that that's exported. So let's go ahead and export create session client, save that. Let's bring this in here. We'll do create session client. Now we're going to change this as well to create session client. But before we do anything, let's go ahead and get some cookies here. So we're going to import cookies. We want to make sure that we actually can read those cookies, see if we have a session in there. So we're going to call import cookies from next headers, make sure we got the right one. Then in here, we're going to call const session cookie, and we're going to go ahead and call cookies dot get, and we're going to check for a session value here. So now the next step here is to go ahead and create this condition. So I'm going to go ahead and create this try catch statement. Oh, that's right. I'm coming from a Python background, so it's try catch. So I always get mixed up here. So we'll pass in the error, and let's go ahead and return that. Then let's go ahead and get this response right here. Let's paste this in. And for this catch statement, let's go ahead and bring this in up here. For this error, first of all, I want to console out the error so we can actually see it. Console.error. And we just want to get the error itself. And let's go ahead and return this response. So we'll do response.json. And in here, I just want to go ahead and create a message that says access denied. So we want to make sure that, first of all, the user knows that they're blocked. And then we're going to go ahead and pass in a status code of 403. So we'll do status 403. So let's go ahead and check this out. So right now, when I try to make this request, we're going to try to access the database. We don't even need to check for a user. And I just realized we need to take this session cookie, and we're going to do session cookie dot value like that. So if we don't have a session cookie, or this request doesn't work, for some reason the user can't get authenticated within this process, it's going to return an error, which means that we're going to return access denied right here. Let's check this out. So now if I refresh that, here we go. We see the access denied message. That's exactly what we want. So the next thing I want to do is go ahead and actually log in this user so I can create a session. So that way we can actually make this authenticated request. So we're going to use this login form. And typically what you would do is create some kind of API route. You would make this a client rendered component. You would trigger a function, call that API route, set a session cookie once it's generated, and you're good to go from there. So what I want to use instead are server actions. And server actions are something that I believe were introduced in Next 13 and stabilized in 14, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, they're functions, they're async functions that can be run on the server side. So we don't have to do things that you would typically do inside of a typical client component. And let me just show you how this works. So first of all, we're going to go into our login page, and we're just going to go ahead and create an async function. So it has to be an async function. And we're just going to go ahead and call this create session. And in here, in order to make this a server function, you're just going to call use server. Now, from here, let's go ahead and actually trigger it. So first of all, I want to console out some form data. So we'll do console.log, and we're going to get the form data that's actually triggered with the function. So we'll throw that in, and then we want to actually trigger the function from our login form. So we have this prop now we can call action in order to trigger a server action, and we're going to call create session here. Now, for this login form, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and set some default values so I don't have to keep re-entering my username and email. So we'll do dennis@email.com, and we're going to pass in my password real quick, throw this in, and we'll just do password 123. So whatever you set for your user in your Appwrite account, go ahead and pass that in. So right now, this is a server action. So typically you would have to do something like e.prevent default when you're, or not else, but e.prevent default and go through that whole process with a client side function. We don't have to do that anymore. So let's go ahead and actually run this. So we'll go to our form. So right here, we see our console, and let's trigger this. So if I click login, use server form data. Oh, I need to throw in form data in here, form data like that. Let's go ahead and run this. So now if I click login, we should see the form data output here. So you notice we don't have extra functionality here. And here we can actually see the form data itself. So let's go ahead and actually parse this data here. So I want to get this, and I want to start by creating a session here. So let's go ahead and move this down here. So we'll do const data object.from entries, and we're going to pass in form data in here, and let's go ahead and actually get our email and password. So let's go ahead and throw that in. That's going to be equal to data, and let's just remove our console log right there. And this is where we actually need to create our admin client and make a certain request. So this is why it was important. So think about this. In order to actually create a session, you can't do this as a session client because you don't have a session yet. So that client is not authenticated or authorized to make that request. So we create an admin client with an API key that has a lot of permissions, like creating a session. So that admin client creates a session, and then from there, we move to the session client. So this is exactly where we need that. So let's go ahead and import our admin client. So we'll import create admin client. Then from here, let's go ahead and actually get our account instance, and this is going to be await, and we'll create the admin client. Once we have the account instance, we can go ahead and actually generate the session here. So let's go ahead and do const session is going to be equal to await, and we'll call account.create email password session. And within this, we can just go ahead and pass in the email and password. So this client right here is allowed to make that request. So we first generate a session. Then what we want to do is go ahead and actually set the session within our browser's cookies. So let's go ahead and import cookies. So from next headers, that just got imported right there. We're going to call cookies.set, and we're going to set the key to session. So we're going to set the session. Then we want to actually set the value. So the value is going to be our session.secret. And then here we pass along any extra settings that we want for this cookie. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and just type them out. I'm not going to go over each detail. I'll recommend just copying what I'm doing here. So let's go ahead and set HTTP only to true. Then we're going to set same site, and we're going to set this to strict. Okay, and from here, we want to go ahead and set secure to true. And then we want to set the expire date. So when does this expire? And we're just going to go ahead and do new date, and we're going to call session.expire like that. And the last parameter is going to be path here. So we'll do path, and we're going to set that to the home route. So we create our session, we set our session cookie, and then we just want to go ahead and import redirect, and we want to redirect the user as they log in. So the last thing we'll do after that is just go ahead and do redirect, and we'll just send the user to the dashboard. So the only issue with this right now is because of our middleware, we're going to be sent to the dashboard, and then our middleware is going to send us back to the login page. And that's fine, but just know that the redirect functionality is not going to work the way it needs to right now. So we still have some more work to do on here. But what I want to make sure we can actually see is that we can actually create a session. I want to see that session being set, and then I want to make sure that we can access this protected API route right here. So let's go ahead and hit inspect element. Let's go into application, and let's just see how this sets the session cookies. So I'm going to hit login, and we're going to give this a second, and that's going to set our session. So right now we just got redirected back to the login page. It happened quick, but we are technically authenticated here. So here we see our session cookie. So that means that in theory, with this API route, we should be able to refresh this, and we have this session. So we should be able to access this page. So if we take a look at our console though, we're going to see this error, and it says we are not authorized to make this request. Well, we are authenticated. Why not? Well, the issue is we're now using a session client, which means that this session client now has to abide by collection permissions. So our API key had basically like boss level permissions. We're able to access anything, but because of our collection here, we actually need to go into settings and we need to set our permissions. So let's go ahead and set all users. This means that all logged in users can make read requests to this specific collection. And now when I refresh this, I should be able to see all this data. So these are all the orders here. If I delete the session, I refresh it, I'm logged out. Then when I log back in, it's going to go ahead and just update this session right here. Now I can see it, and that's exactly what I wanted to do. So from here, I have a few other things that I want to take care of. So in order to actually be able to visit the homepage, so we're still technically being blocked out of our homepage, I can't access this because this user and this middleware. So I'm going to create a function that actually requests to actually be able to see that user. We want to be able to get the current user and then move on from there. So I'm going to bring this new file here into source, and we're going to call this auth.js. So within this file, we're going to create an object here that's going to contain all methods that have to deal with any form of authentication. So anything that we need to get a user, create a session, which we're going to move this function from our login page to this object right here. Anything to delete a session, basically anything with auth methods are going to be inside of this file. So we'll just export default right away. Let's go ahead and do default auth like that. So within this object, first thing I want to do is go ahead and get our user. So we're going to set some default values. So our user is going to be null, and then our session cookie is also going to be set to null. So those are our default values. Then we want to create some functions. So we're going to create a function called get user, and this is going to be an async function. And within this function, we're just going to go ahead and check our cookies. We want to see if we have a session. If we do, we're going to get the user and then return that user. If we don't, we're just going to return null for the user. And this is how we figure out if we have a user or not. So let's go ahead and import cookies here. So we'll import cookies like that from Next headers. Then let's go ahead and do auth.user or actually auth.session cookie is going to be equal to cookies.get, and we want to get the session. So once we have our cookies, or once we figure out if we have one or not, let's go ahead and run try catch. And inside of our catch, we're just going to go ahead and check for or console out the error. So console error, go ahead and just finish up some default stuff here. Let's go ahead and try to make this request. So we're going to create an account instance. So we'll do account, and this is going to be await from create session client. So with our session client, we just imported that automatically. Let's go ahead and pass in auth.sessionCookie.value. So we get our session cookie, we pass that into our session client, create an account instance. And from here, what I'm going to do is go ahead and create our user. So auth.user or get our user. We'll call await, and this is going to be account.get like that. And that's all we need to do with Appwrite to get our user. Now with this, after the try statement, let's go ahead and return auth.user. And if anything for some reason doesn't work out here, we're going to set auth.user to null and auth.sessionCookie to null as well. Okay, so now that we have this function, let's go into our middleware, and we want to bring this in here and actually check for our user on each request. So we're going to import auth, and I don't know why the alias isn't working, but that path still does work. Then we're going to go to user, call await, and this is going to be auth.getUser. And now we're actually going to check for a user if something doesn't work. Then we're going to redirect our user, and before we do that, let's just call request.cookies.delete. So if something doesn't work out, I just want to go ahead and delete the session and just make sure that it doesn't actually linger there. Okay, so at this point, there are still some errors or some issues that are going to occur that I'm actually aware of, and I want to face them one by one. So first, I just want to show you that in theory, we can actually access our login page. So let me just refresh everything from scratch. Let's go to our application and let's see something with our page. Oh, okay. So I happen to comment this out off screen. So let's go ahead and open that up. So right now I'm actually accessing my homepage, and this error is something that I was expecting. So what's happening here is actually, before I tell you about the error, let me show you that we're actually able to access the page. So the error is occurring in this request here, and that's why I had that commented out. So we have our orders, and that's going to be an empty array. So here, if we have a session, we're actually able to access the page. I just want to make sure that you're aware of this. If we go ahead and delete it, refresh it, then we're logged out and we can't access it. But once we log in, it's going to redirect us and we should be good. Maybe I didn't click that. Okay, there we go. That should, in theory, redirect us to the page. So we can actually access the home page. So the issue is occurring somewhere in this request. So here's what's happening. When I'm making a request to this route goes ahead and it checks our cookies and it looks for a session. Now, when I access this route manually like this, so when I try to get this route just like that, it's going ahead and accessing these cookies right here. It's getting this session and everything works. The problem here is that this function right here is run on the server. So typically, when you're making an Axios request, you can add in a with credentials flag that will take your cookies and it'll pass them along to wherever it's making the request. But this request is being made on the server, so it doesn't have access to the same information as it normally would. So what we need to do is we need to manually just go ahead and pass along our cookies with this request. So I'm going to show you how to do this right now. Then I'm going to add in like a cleanup function that makes this a little bit more automated. So with this request right now, when I call it, when I try to go to this page, now we get this error is basically blowing things up because it can't make that request. So let's go ahead and pass in a parameter here. So we just want to go ahead and actually pass in some headers. And we're going to do this manually. So within our headers, we're going to set this cookie value. So this is what we're sending to our backend. Then we're going to say session is equal to, and we're going to import cookies like that from next headers. And let's go ahead and actually get our session cookie. Session cookie is equal to cookies. And we'll do .get. We're going to get our session, and we're going to take this session cookie, and we're just going to pass it through to the backend. So session cookie dot value like that. And this in theory should work. So now we're sending that request to this route. So this route can actually get that session. So here we go. That works now. And we're able to access the backend. Again, if we delete that session, we can't make that work anymore. So I hope that makes sense. Basically, this route needs a cookie and we need to throw that through manually. So what I want to do really quick is make sure, first of all, that our login page redirects us. So when we're logged in, I should not be able to access this login page. So let's go ahead and just fix this. Let's go into the login page itself. And within this page, we're just going to import what we already have redirect. So let's go ahead and check a condition. So we're going to do const user is going to be equal to await auth.get user. Let's import auth right here. And we also want to make sure this is an async function. So this is the login page, as you can see right there. And we're going to say if we have a user, let's go ahead and redirect our user to, let's just go to the dashboard, so the home page. Okay, so just a little bit of cleanup. Now when we try to go to login, it automatically sends us here. And then if we delete the session, it kicks us out. So we have that. I also want to clean up this function. So this server action, what I want to do is actually take all of this, copy that, and delete it. So this is going to be our login page now. And we're going into auth here. And I'm just going to import this function right here. So we're going to call create session. So we're going to pass this in right here. And we're going to change this right here. So we're going to call create session. And this is going to be as an attribute. We'll do async and we'll make this an arrow function like that. And that should clean it up. So now we have our create session function within our auth object. So within this page here, so the login page, let's see, where's login? We can import auth. And now all we have to do is call auth.createSession. So let's just make sure things work before we build in that cleanup function, and then we add in our logout functionality. So let's go back. Let's delete the session. We just refresh, takes us to the login page. And I know the styling isn't perfect, but it works. Now when we hit login, create admin client is not defined. So we need to go into auth here. Let's import create admin client. And let's just refresh that or log in. That should redirect us. And redirect is not defined. Okay, so just a few things that we need to clean up before. So import redirect, and that's from Next navigation. And let's just hope everything works now. Okay, delete it, refresh, login, and that works. Okay, for this next part, what I want to do is simplify this request right here so we don't have to pass in our cookie every single time in our header on every request. So right now, it's not that big of a deal. We just pass it in and it works. But what if we want to make multiple requests throughout our application? So typically, Axios actually has something called interceptors, which work kind of like middleware, where before the actual call is made, you can basically insert certain things into data or into your headers like this, and it'll work just fine. But if you're using something else like fetch or whatever your preference is for making a request, I want to show you sort of not a hacky method, but my personalized method in actually making this request and basically creating my own middleware, so to speak. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create like a wrapper function around this request, and then we're going to use that wrapper function. So we won't have to pass this in within the page. So let's go ahead and create a new folder within my source folder here, and we're going to call this lib, and then we're going to call this Axios instance.js like that. So this function right here is first going to import Axios, then we're going to import our cookies. So we'll just do import cookies from next headers, and with this, we're going to create a function called Axios instance, and this is going to be an async function. And at its core, all this function is going to do is go ahead and return Axios, and that's it like that. And we're going to pass in some parameters here. So we're still going to be calling this request method right here, but we're going to pass in our headers or our URL through the params or as a prop, and then we'll pass in the method. But before we actually make this request, so we're going to pass this in right here like that, and then the HTTP method, we're also going to pass in our headers. And this is the trick. Basically, before we actually call this request, we're just going to go ahead and call const headers, and headers is going to be equal to, we're just going to grab this right here, basically our cookie. We're going to grab that, and then we also just want to go ahead and get our session cookie like this. So we already imported it. So we're basically getting our cookie, setting it in our headers, and passing it through. So let's go ahead and export default Axios instance. So again, if you know what interceptors are and how those work, I'd recommend just doing that. But this is just a different way of doing things. So we pass this through, and now within our page, in theory, we can just go ahead and get rid of all of this. We can get rid of our cookies. We can import Axios instance. And here we can just go ahead and change this to await. And we're going to call Axios instance here. So Axios instance, and I'm going to call it like this. So instead of using the method, we're going to pass this in. Then we're just going to remove this right here, and we're just going to pass in the method directly. So this is now going to be an object here, or a key value pair, and we'll just indent this. And let's just do method is equal to get like that. So that's just another way to use Axios. And let's see, it looks like I have an error. So this is going to be URL like that. And now we call response. So we call the get method, and then orders is going to be request or response.data. So we have response like that. Just want to make sure that this is correct. Let's save this, and let's just give this a test, and then we'll regroup. So I'm going to refresh it, and that worked just fine. So here we go. We have this Axios instance. We attach our header and we make the typical request and everything works just fine. So pretty neat, huh? That way we don't have to use interceptors. If you're using something else, it should work just fine. So let's go ahead and actually create our logout functionality. Now, before we actually create that, we're going to go ahead and create different layouts. So right now we have this layout for our main page. So within the app directory, we have this layout right here. And this is the layout for the main page itself. What I'm going to do is go ahead and create a new layout, and then we'll add the header into that layout so it only shows up when we're logged in. So the way that we're going to do this is use something called route groups, which allow us to create a set of routes in a different folder without actually changing that file path or folder path for our routes. And in there, we can create another layout file and actually have that layout apply to those specific routes. So let me show you what I mean by this. So within this app folder, here our homepage is within the app folder. But in order to create a route group, what we can do is go ahead and use the parentheses, and we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to call this protected here. So here we have another folder, and I can, in theory, just go ahead and take this page and bring this into the protected folder. Now, in theory, you would think, oh, this is going to create a route called protected, and it's going to mess our application up. But that's not the case, because now within our app folder, we don't have a page.js. That's now within the protected folder here. So if I go to my homepage, let's go ahead and just refresh this. We're going to see that everything works just fine. The file path did not change. We just have that in a different folder. Now, what this allows us to do is it allows us to go ahead and just create another layout file here. So we have a layout file for our entire application. And now within here, we're just going to go ahead and call this layout.js. And let's just go ahead and do React function component here. Let's make sure that it's all done correctly. We're just going to pass in our children. So we'll throw that in. And let's pass this in right here. Forgot to do that. And we're going to call this protected layout here. Okay, so now every single thing within this folder is now going to use this layout as well as the parent directory. So I can just go ahead and show you this. So we're just going to indent that, and we're going to call this protected. We'll just do H1 protected like that. And let's take a look. So now within my page, in theory, I should see that we have protected here. But if I log out, that protected text right there won't be inside of the login page, because the login page is not part of this layout group. So that's the idea of route groups. So within this, let's go ahead and actually create our header. So we're going to create a folder called components, and we're going to create a file called header.js. And let's go ahead and create the function here. So let's go ahead and make this an async function, because we do need to import auth, because we want to get the user from here. So let's just do const user is equal to await, and we can call auth.getUser. So within the actual component itself, let's go ahead and change this to header. And in that global CSS file, I did add some styling to this tag. So if you want to follow along with exactly what I'm doing, make sure you call that header. So first thing is I'm going to go ahead and add in some empty fragments, and we're going to check for a user. So if we have a user, let's go ahead and just return with a strong tag. We'll do a tag here, not just a text. So strong, and we're going to pass in hello, and then the user name here. So we're going to do user.name. Now, the only issue here is sometimes we may not have a username. So we'll put in a question mark there, and then we'll just do or, and then user.email. So we may not have a username, but we definitely will have a user email. So we're just going to say hello with the user. Then we can just go ahead and pass this into our layout. So we'll go into our protected layout. Let's import our header, and let's pass that in right here. So this will be header / save that, and let's take a look. So here we go. We see hello Dennis Ivy, and that takes care of our header. So the next thing I want to do is take care of the logout functionality. So let's go ahead and add this into our auth instance. So we'll remove or close this out for the layout. We don't need the layouts right now. We don't need our pages at the moment. Let's go into the auth instance, and we're going to create a delete user function. So we'll call this delete, not user, but delete session. And we'll go ahead and make this an async function. Let's go ahead and close this off. And this is going to be a server action. So we'll do use server. And the first thing I want to do is go ahead and get our session cookie. So let's go ahead and grab that. And we're going to set this to cookies. And then this will be .get. We'll get the current session because we want to be able to get this user and then actually delete the session. So let's go ahead and add in the try catch statement, throw in catch, and pass in the error. And for now, we're just going to leave this blank like this. So within the try statement, we're going to go ahead and actually get the user here. So we're going to get the account, and then we'll call await create session client. We'll pass in auth.sessionCookie.value, and then we're going to call await account.delete session. And here I can just pass in current, and that should delete the current session. So right after, what I want to do is go ahead and call cookies, and then we're going to call delete, and this is going to delete this from our browser here. So we're going to delete the session cookie here. And at this point, I just want to go ahead and set auth.user, and that's going to be null. Make sure just to reset everything, auth.sessionCookie, and that's also going to be null. And we want to redirect a user once they're finished up with this process. So let's go ahead and send them back to the login page. So let's go ahead and save this. And within my headers here, let's go ahead and actually add in this functionality. So this is a server action. We had to make sure it's async. We called use server. Let's go ahead and actually trigger this. So a server action has to be triggered from a form. So we're going to go ahead and create this form, and we're going to create a button within that form. And this is going to say log out. And here I can just go ahead and pass in action, and we're going to pass in auth.delete session. Okay, so let's go ahead and just make sure everything's working. So now I should, in theory, be able to see this logout button right here. Now, within my Appwrite console, let's go ahead and go to this actual user, and I want to make sure the user is actually, or the session is deleted from my backend too, because if I just remove it from my browser, it doesn't actually delete the session, it just removes it from my cookies. So I want to make sure that it's actually removed here. And here we're going to go to this user, and because we haven't been deleting our session, let's just go ahead and remove any sessions that you have in here. So go to the Sessions tab. Go ahead and let's log in here. So right now, if I refresh it, this should log me out. And let's log in. From this point on, I should see a session appear here. Okay, so here's the session. Now when I click log out, let's test it. Let's hope it's all working. This, in theory, should delete the session. So now it's gone from my cookies here, and it should be gone from here. So let's hope, fingers crossed. And there we go. Okay, so that does it for this video. I hope you learned a bunch. Make sure to leave me feedback down in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe to the Appwrite YouTube channel, and I'll see you all in the next video.